Thank you, Perry. Our last panelist for today is Francesca Hughes, who's the author of numerous books and essays, including The Architecture of Error, Matter, Measure, and the Misadventures of Precision, and most recently, Architectures of Prediction. Having taught for almost 3 decades at the Architectural Association and the Bartlett School of Architecture in London, she was head of school at UTS Sydney from 2018 to 2020, and is currently working on a cultural prehistory of the architect's computer, tentatively titled An Indiscrete History of the Architect's Universal Discrete Machine. And the title of her talk today is Filthy Logics in Praise of Pointlessness. Francesca, yes.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you very much. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
I'm going to jump into screen share. And there, is that good? Can you see my slideshow? Yeah. So thank you, Laura, Perry, everyone, Michael, for the wonderful invitation. It's thanks to COVID that we're all adapted to Zoom, which means I can, all the way from Australia, be here. So there are some silver linings. And I also kind of want to thank you for raising this incredibly timely question. It's a big pleasure to be discussing it with Eric and Mark in the same panel. Incredibly timely, although as kind of Mark intimated, it's obviously something I've been thinking about for quite a while. And faced with it, I was slightly thinking, oh my God, I've got so much to say about this topic. What does one do? So I've forced myself to come in at a different angle. I've taken myself out of my comfort zone. And partly because there is so much to make one feel uncomfortable right now. And I've been turning to Beckett rather bizarrely as a source of comfort, and particularly to these logics. I've been finding, to this quote, I've been finding comfort in Beckett's arch construction of exacting pointlessness in the face of certain logics to which we are all seemingly succumbing, and in particular to these closing words from his interview with Charles Juliet in 1977. So just to put it in context, I'm speaking from Australia. Australia is not dealing with race. That's going to be for the future for Australia. Australia is going to have to deal with it. In Australia, what we're dealing with is extraordinary measure of a virus in an environment where, for instance, there's been no contact transmission, no community transmission in New South Wales for the last week, and yet the state is still closed, the borders are closed, and we're really observing incredible kind of use of the measuring of a virus by the state to increase control in quite extraordinary ways. So at a moment when measure of positive instances of a virus in a population's bloodstream is able to bisect an open landscape through which a state border falls, wrap a city with an invisible and impenetrable wall, turn a residential tower block or a cruise ship or a hotel into a kind of 3-week prison, and then flip everything into reverse, kind of almost at the flick of a switch, the exacting action of measure onto architecture, the city, our lives, and the logic this measure attends to has never been more vivid nor more palpable. Every dimension of our existence, it seems, is being scripted by an incredible pencil grip of 19th century statistics with digital solutionism. That is, big data deployed as a kind of quick fix that eternally postpones addressing the root causes of a problem, whilst always, of course, systematically rejecting any political alternative. Yevgeny Morozov's prediction that the pandemic will do for the solutionist state what 9/11 did for the surveillance state, in Australia at least, is fast becoming confirmed. So I'd therefore like today to consider exactitude through the frame of big data's incredible debt to 19th century's most lasting architectural legacy, that of this curve, and its Rubin vase-like flip from the law of error to capital N normal curve. From a thinking about error to be tolerated to a thinking about the center to be capitalized upon, in a sense, how to colonize indeterminacy in order to run an empire. The law of error emerged, as we know, from comparing readings in astronomy. And what's interesting is that two astronomers who turned from their telescopes to measuring the world are kind of particularly important in rethinking this legacy. Adolphe Kettler, who ultimately measures everything and in so doing ostensibly ends up measuring kind of nothing, and Joseph Vallot, who measures that thing that evades all measure, the glacier, and effectively ends up measuring measure itself. Both attend to the construction of a filthy logic, to use Brackett's phrase. The history of architecture, of the architecture of this curve, known variously as the Gaussian, binomial, or normal distribution, is the history of a branch of mathematics whose saturation of all aspects of existence exceeded even that of calculus, in fact is exceeding even that of calculus, and is only recently outstripped by that of big data, its contemporary incarnation as this Victorian legacy comes home to roost. To understand this legacy, we must return to Ian Hacking's incredible 1990s Taming of Chance, newly relevant, in which he accounts how the sacred pansophic projects of the Enlightenment were finally rendered profane in the 19th century with this kind of fever of measuring and counting, the avalanche of numbers that saw to the beginning of statistics prediction industrialized. In the projects of early statisticians, statistical laws came to be understood as laws in their own right, a new kind of objective logic or objective knowledge. And in this first information age, the nascent technologies for harvesting information were busy, in a sense, feeding this new kind of law, as French rational moral science seeded slowly to empirical moral science. Both architecture and the computer were there from the very start. The first use of the term constant as a fixed value attached to an abstract property and thus a coefficient for a law appeared in 1831 in a handbook of tables for tensile strengths of cast iron beams and columns for engineers and for architects. The next year, Charles Babbage proposed the collection of all constants of nature and art, the counting of all things, including, for instance, how much a man can saw in 10 hours, be it oak or elm or stone, how many female children born out of wedlock, the velocities of different birds flying from Liverpool to New York, of course, the speed of light, also slightly important, the heights of buildings, frequency of letters in different languages, so cryptography is there from the start. All of this to fill, as the Hacking chapter on this so exquisitely lays out, his granary of science, which was Babbage's term, as if Babbage somehow instinctively knew the offspring of his difference engines would have some kind of insatiable appetite for data. Two of the streams of letters that Adolphe Kettler writes to the Grand Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha on the theory of probabilities as applied to the moral and political sciences, that's their title, are important for the conversation here. One, on his algorithm by which to predict the blooming of lilac in a Brussels spring, and another regarding the distribution of dwarfs and giants in a given population. Both are exquisite finger exercises in the data control that would master the colonies and then quietly underpin much of that which became infrastructural to the materialization of modernism. Material sciences, standards and specifications, identicality and mass production, to name but a few. And ultimately, of course, guarantee the ascendancy of big data. Our first letter then, that regarding lilac in spring, addresses that most capricious of events, the arrival of spring, which Kettler apparently brings to heel by the new scope of measure. Quoting Kettler, "Even the flower, so modest as it is not the product of caprice of nature. Its frail tissue requires favorable conditions for its development, and to arrive at its full bloom, it follows laws as stable as those which preside over the progress of the worlds. Picking up then, where Linnaeus had apparently failed for lack of precision, Quetelet sets out to discover and fix the law by which to predict the lilac blossoming and render stable this, quote, labyrinth where so many threads cross each other. To this end, all threads or variables are systematically cut out of the picture, including that of the observers, themselves a new cause of error, each with their propensity to mark the epochs of blooming later than another. So the flowering of Syringa vulgaris is then, not without some eroticism, fixed as that day on which the first corolla opens and shows its stamina. All plants are observed to be equally healthy, aged, vigorous, fed, positioned in equal soil under equal conditions. After just a few springs, such as the miracle of statistics, he's able to declare by induction that all lilacs in Brussels flower when the sum of the squares of the mean daily temperature since the last frost reaches exactly 4,264 degrees centigrade. Quetelet's extraordinary law of lilacs, like fundamental laws it emulates, comprises an equation plus a constant, and thus endowed, like all laws in predicting when lilac will flower, which becomes the normative state, then establishes that which is deviant. Tardy and premature lilacs and their host cities abound. Brussels becomes the kind of prime meridian of global lilac blossoming. Other cities in the world are defined in terms of being in retardation or in advance of Brussels' 0 hour. However, to Quetelet's evident irritation, the new map of the world as defined by lilac behavior is unfortunately irregular. Quoting Quetelet, "The line which may be drawn through the globe, through all the places where a plant may flower on the same day, the isosthetic line, is not necessarily parallel to the line which passes through the places where the plant flowered 10 or 20 days earlier. That is, if his law is to better meet deviation, it's going to need to admit more variables." Quetelet's attempt to align the blossoming of lilac with Cartesian space reminds us that all measure is not measuring the real, but is in fact creating the real, and doing so in order to then ostensibly remeasure, control, and predict this new alias for the real. Think of the curves that we now daily consume and seek to flatten that are real. And I'm assuming in America, you're looking at probably quite different curves right now, that of poles. Think also of the ascendancy of live data feeds that are increasingly determining everything about our physical environment, not least its architecture. There you go, that's the filthiest thing I could find for now. In a sense, the music says it all. Suffice to say that Quetelet-Galton et al.'s erection of the normal curve with its attendant statistical logics was arguably the biggest infrastructural project of the 19th century, and it was virtual, and again, like big data, it had immediate concrete footprints in rewriting the world and its predictability. In our second letter regarding the distribution of dwarfs and giants, Quetelet's bizarre fixation with lilac reveals its true ambitions. After lilac's denial of longitude, the size of man is brought to heel by Francis Galton's Procrustean bed of the law of error, Galton's words, with its apparent tolerance of deviation. In a letter entitled Ordinary and Extraordinary Events, Monstrosities, Quetelet performs with science what he performed with time in the case of lilac, but with a crucial difference, seeking not the absolute resolution of calculation, but the negotiated largesse of the bell curve. This time, the shoe, newly elastic, fits. But do not be fooled by the installation of generosity in the system. The corrective impulse remains. Quoting Quetelet, I seek to give a more exact appreciation to things which everyone, according to his caprice, gives the most arbitrary values. The genius of the filthy logics of the normal curve is its use of scale to temper to the point of eradication caprice, chance domesticated by probability. Quetelet discovered the miracle of distance, that by zooming out in time and space effectively regulated all irregularities. In 1829, he'd reported his shock at the frightening regularity with which the same crimes are produced year after year. Regularity, it seems, was to be found not simply in rational events, but also in events as irrational as crime, and most especially events as irrational as the crime of suicide. Suicide powered the beginning of statistics, and in a sense, it's this telling, suicide being the kind of ultimate response, the ultimate logical response to a filthy logic. For Kant, this new truth of political arithmetic was no less than the discovery of a natural purpose in this idiotic course of human things, a history of a definite plan for creatures who have no plan of their own. Ever the astronomer, Quetelet's response was that this mass regularity, quoting Quetelet, shows that the laws of conservation can exist in the moral world just as they are found in the physical world. Man is restrained in such a circle that the great laws of nature are forever exempted from his influence. Thus, like the planets, we too are trapped in an orbit as we evolve around the commanding axis of the normal curve. With a sufficiently big sample, births, marriages, deaths, all appeared to occur according to laws as stable as those of the seasons. Obvious theological explanations followed. However, the theological implications were less obvious for the regularity of crimes, and even less obvious when presented with Laplace's extraordinary discovery that the number of dead letters in the Parisian postal system, those letters that for whatever reason don't make it through the system, never arrive, was all a return to sender, was constant from year to year. Clearly, God has a sense of humor, and ostensibly the French too, as they put Laplace on the stamp, which I think is rather delicious. Eugenics. So then it was not until Galton's 1888 description of the capital N normal curve then that Brousset's and Constan's normal, meaning typical, and Quetelet's curve, whose centers denoted the space of the right and the good, inevitably came together under Galton's capital N normal curve, and Galton's project was, of course, eugenics. This curve, as Galton instructs us, is to be worshipped. I know scarcely anything so apt to impress the imagination as the wonderful form of cosmic order expressed by the law of error. A savage, if he could understand it, would worship it as a god. It reigns with severity in complete self-effacement amidst the wildest confusion. The huger the mob, the greater the anarchy, the more perfect its sway. So, listen to this, it's extraordinary. Self-effacement, its reign is invisible. The greater the anarchy, the more perfect its sway. Dude, it's all kind of chillingly familiar right now. Let a large sample of chaotic events be taken and marshaled in order of their magnitudes, and then, however wildly irregular they appeared, an unexpected and most beautiful form of regularity proves to have been present all along. In a later rendition of this statement, the savage is flipped to the ancient Greeks, which is kind of extraordinary, and much like the inversion of the law of error to the normal curve. The scope of this new law is breathtaking. not only it seems was nothing outside of its logic, but upside down or inside out, whichever way we kind of understand this curve, it still decided all. It fitted everything, from Laplace's lost letters, to Ketele's giants and dwarfs, to Maxwell's distribution of molecular velocities in a gas, to Galton's disappearance of the traits of genius in a family. Through its lens, the whole world was trim, symmetrically distributed around a central axis, like the loading of cargo in the ships servicing an empire. And clearly, Alejandro, you spoke earlier about symmetry. I'm sorry, I was asleep. It was the middle of the night here, but I hope to hear more about it soon. Ketele's homme moyenne, then, was also an homme moral, and both had temporal dimensions scripting their rate of growth and rate of moral development. In the production of Ketele's homme moyenne, the measuring of limbs is fairly straightforward, but the measuring of morality of the homme moyenne moral was more tricky. How to measure bravery, criminality, amorousness. He acknowledges that while it would be possible to design a series of kind of time-consuming, cross-referenced experiments, one could, of course, simply record the number of brave, criminal, or amorous acts committed in a given year, and then divide that number by the number of the population, assigning the fraction as a penchant for criminality, etc., within the homme moyenne moral. André Michel Guéry produced a map of the distribution of such penchants for France's departments, with Corsica, of course, winning as the hotbed of immorality. And he even produced an immoral statistic computer, which he called an ordonnateur statistique, to confirm his conclusions, anticipating the word ordinateur that IBM and Jacques Perrot introduced in France in 1955. Thus, through this simple act of reverse engineering, 19th century data established the authority of the exactitude of the inexact, that could even be, paradoxically, confirmed by mechanical calculation. The exactitude of the inexact was thus enshrined by a double objectivity, that of data and that of the machine. This is a double objectivity we understand very well now, manifest today in more ways than we can count, as we find ourselves the subject of endless and invisible counting. The exactitude of the inexact has developed precocious rhetorical strategies. Think of the language. Think of the term, the digital nudge. You know, it's not the kind of prick or the kind of pinch. It's the nudge. It's kind of clearly a calculated dialing back from Facebook's poke, but all the better to this nudge, this kind of cloaked in approximateness, is all the better to conceal its utter confidence in its ability to persuade, to determine outcomes, to change our course of events. Our decision-making, including our designing, is being engineered like never before. And this engineering, like most engineering, owes more to the 19th century, that is hacking's first information age, than many accounts of the second information age would care to admit. These guys are masters of cause and effect and masters of only the amount of precision that you need, a kind of really exact form of exactitude. So if Ketele made average height into something real, then Galton made correlation, that is like partial causation, as real as cause. So by correlation, what Galton sets up is that A is not the sole cause of B, but it contributes to the production of B. Carl Pearson, in Grammar of Science, later wrote that faced with the new powers of correlation, quoting Pearson, the conception of causation, unlimitedly profitable to the physicist, began to crumble to pieces. In no case was B simply and wholly caused by A, nor indeed by C, D, E, F as well. It was really possible to go on increasing the numbers of contributory causes until they might involve all the factors of the universe. Henceforward, the philosophical view of the universe was to be that of a correlated system of variates, approaching but by no means reaching perfect correlation, i.e. no means reaching absolute causality. Galton's correlation, then, for all intents and purposes, killed cause. Such was the new autonomy of statistical law that it killed not only caprice at one end of the determinacy-indeterminacy spectrum, but also killed cause, killed total determinism at the other end, the neutralization of both being a necessary prerequisite for big data's ascendancy. While Babbage's data harvest was to be stored for future use, Quetelet's was for the present application, or to be more precise, for the prediction of present futures. 19th century statisticians already understood, long before von Neumann's, all processes that are stable we shall predict, all processes that are unstable we shall control, that if you can explain something, you can control it. His two explanatory models that obviously were very good at controlling the story for a while. And of course, if you can control something, you can predict it. The autonomy that procures predictive power is predicated always on the ability of a model to explain the explananda it describes. Explanatory power's first priority then is always rhetorical. Alignment with the truth or the real is always a secondary concern, indeed a luxury. For the normal curve, this was ultimately secured by Galton's ingenious design of the quincunx, presented in 1893 in a lecture to the Royal Institution. So in this machine, Galton designed this box. Lead shot is dropped in through the top. I mean, you may well know it. It's a very famous thing. Comes through a filter and then is percolated through rows of pins that are offset, like the points of 5 on a dice on the side of the dice, and pile up, yes, at the bottom according to the normal curve. But crucially, the normal curve is supported by these partitions that basically allow the piled up lead shot to exceed the angle of repose. Thus, these partitions erase materiality, gravity, geometry, everything that might organize the angle of repose. This very clever rhetorical machine, with its harnessing of evident indeterminacy in order to make evident its ability to determine, employs strategic transparency in every sense, in order to gain ideological purchase on logic and utility. This was the 19th century after all, and things had to have utility. There was a complicated empire to be run. Quoting Galton, typical laws will never be exactly correct, but at the same time will always be approximately true and always serviceable for explanation. The quincunx, or Galton board as it became named, like the cloud chamber or the Van de Graaff generator, and I'm tempted to add the guillotine to this list of epistemic machines, but that's probably a longer story for another day. But all of these epistemic machines work by rendering visible and comprehensible that which is invisible and incomprehensible. They do the explaining, so they own the truth. But it's important to remember that that machine is also this machine, these extraordinary composite photographs that Galton made of different human types, Galton's English, private soldiers, murderers, consumptives, and Jews. Galton commented that his composites were always better looking than their components because the average portrait of many persons is free from the irregularities that variously blemish the looks of each of them. The legacy of this machine is also this machine, Google image recognition software. And we know from Diderot already that overfitting is always a dangerous business. The irreducibility that delivers the universality of the universal law becomes, in statistical laws, their undisputed autonomy from any specificity that might challenge their epistemological security or might blemish their good looks. This very big picture, in its absorbing of all erratics, is detail-proof. Similarly, all phenomena are accounted for, all external properties are disarmed. Caprice and causality has been neutralized. The final genius of statistics in its creation of the real is its elimination of any outside. Its exacting use of inexactness means that no phenomena can evade its elastic fit. It is the ultimate colonizer. Quetelet had always maintained that there should be a single method for all sciences, from astronomy, from mathematics, all the way to the social sciences. Clearly, this was to be it. Ultimately, it is in this permeation of every aspect of life and thought that we find the keenest rehearsal of big data and the exacting inexactness of technological solutionism it is delivering. This too is, of course, a closed system, and we are all trapped inside it. Whereas 19th century industrialized data harvesting was to produce the identicality of the mass-produced for the standardized man, digital data harvesting has produced the differentiality of the customized subject, who are all ultimately similarly different, according to Quetelet's host of petty influences in various combinations. That is to say, we are all ultimately, to all intents and purposes, in our similar difference, still the same. We are all the same. So compelling is Galton's epistemic machine that it secures the institution of its logics for good. This machine does not need to evolve because it's perfect already. An 11-foot high iteration is made by Charles and Ray Eames as the probability machine for their 1961 Mathematica exhibition, where it's positioned like an altar, and here it is, there. Then in 1964, the epistemic performance of the Galton board finally meets that of the computer in their IBM pavilion designed with Saarinen at the World Fair. So the Eames has placed the probability board right here at the entrance, all the better for worshipping. There's much to say about this extraordinary building and the extraordinary film that they produced, but that also will need to be for another time. And here we have Ruskin photographing all the stains and cracks on the Mer de Glace in Chamonix. In the very same year as that Galton was presenting his machine to the Royal Institution, so this is in 1893, our second astronomer, Joseph Vallot, was setting to the measurement of that most capricious object, the glacier, a landscape so evasive of measure that its landmarks with the giant kind of granite boulders that it carries within its shape-shifting mantle not only move, but are called erratics, of course. Vallot, however, was cunning. He understood that in the taming of the glacier, only the glacier could measure the glacier. And this via a kind of peculiar forward engineering of the reverse engineering that is the study of erratics. The deposited boulder is here, therefore the glacier passed through here, therefore it must have started there. Vallot's method is disarmingly simple. He lays 4 lines of brightly painted and numbered stones across the width of the glacier. Each line is then surveyed and plotted onto a map, and the following summer, the following 15th of September, the stones are refound, resurveyed, and plotted back onto the drawing. Thus, the glacier becomes a self-measuring machine, as stones ever so slowly fall with and through it, tracking its very slow descent. This glacier as a self-measuring machine is also a self-explaining machine, translating the white noise of its unpredictable surface, that noise that Ruskin was photographing with his faithful daguerreotypes, into the regular surface waves that span its width. That is, the trim of velocities around its central axis is installed, fastest at the center and getting gradually slower as you go out to the edge of the glacier. The glacier is a live, supine, curved data set, and thus tamed, a magnificent epistemic machine that can predict itself. But this machine is not so compliant. Vallot describes in anxious detail how his cohort of agents, as he calls them, each summer would scurry across the irregular icy surface, installing the line of stones onto which they paint their allocated integers before the line is left to its own devices, or abandonnée à elle-même, or that is to the devices of the glacier, whose progress swallows up the stones into its ever reconfiguring pockets. Less like the balls in the Kingquirks and more like the letters in the Parisian Postal Service, the stones in their lines are left to find or fall their way through the system. Each September, the game of Hunt the Line of Stones would resume. Quoting Vallot, "This hunting of the stones obsessed us." So, Mark said earlier that numbers are erotic. If you need any confirmation, read Vallot's accounts of his hunting of his numbers in the pockets of the glacier. So, the hunting of the stones obsessed us, and we searched out our quarry with fervent ardor, super erotic, leaping across enormous crevices, climbing the sharpest, most slicing arêtes, unroped each unto themselves, in order to search as wide a surface as possible. There were, however, certain terrains that the stones had entered where, defeated by topography, Vallot and his men could not follow, I'm sure to their enormous frustration. Quoting Vallot again, "In the ice cascades where all the seracs had formed into needle-like peaks, one could scarcely find an odd stone balanced on the peak of an arête, almost all having rolled down into the depth of the crevices." Certain stones disappeared in the system for years at a time before the glacier finally returned them to the surface. Vallot and his team of stone hunters soon learned to outweight the glacier's game of hide and seek, calculating that a stone that had fallen into an 8-meter deep crevice would be exposed at the surface 2 summers later. Is this, so in a sense, faced with the kind of the capriciousness of the subject, of the system to be meant, the system of measure acquires a certain craftiness, let's say, in order to install regularity. Is this then the first sign of the beginning of the end of its authority? The cooking of the empirical books? Is this a kind of analog nudge? In Vallot's plotting of the curve, what isomorphic desires drive his need to find every stone within the practice of measure? Does the misseed stone, the thoughted measure, not also count? The character of Molloy in Beckett's novel by the same name is similarly possessed by a set of needs relating famously to stones and pockets and their counting and their sucking. His 16 sucking stones are, following the principle of trim, distributed equally across his body, 4 in each of the pockets on the right-hand side of his greatcoat and trousers, and 4 on the left-hand side of his greatcoat and trousers. Thus loaded, Molloy is a closed system, as he sucks them one at a time in rotation clockwise from pocket to mouth to pocket to pocket to pocket. After a while, however, he comes to the disturbing realization that the system is not safe, that caprice could enter and sabotage its logics, that by, quoting Beckett, an extraordinary hazard, The 4 stones circulating thus might always be the same 4. This hazard becomes intolerable. Such a system, quoting Beckett again, could not long content a man like me. The truth is, I should have needed 16 pockets in order to be quite easy on my mind, for I was beginning to lose all sense of measure. But of course, 16 pockets is impossible. He considers the only alternative, echoing Valor, that of numbering the stones, but this too has its drawbacks. Tracking the numbers requires the bureaucracy of accounting that Babbage and Ketley et al. Poured down their numerical avalanche. No, Beckett again, the only perfect solution would have been the 16 pockets, symmetrically disposed, that is trim, each one with its stone. Then I would have needed neither to number nor to think, but merely as I sucked a given stone to move on to the 15 others. So in a sense, listen to this, neither to number nor to think. Malloy wants to do one thing at a time. Like Turing's tape, Malloy in his processing cycles must behave like a computer. Inevitably, Valo's system too starts to leak and let caprice in. The lines embark on their own misadventures. The Eshley line encounters a region full of crevices and loses its entire right flank, stones 1 to 13 that is, except for stones 5 and 8. Another loses its left flank after suddenly falling into a series of icefalls. The next year, most of these stones reappear, but then in 1898, a terrible year, the Montevers line loses stones 9 to 14, and they all get lost in a zone of enormous sharp waves, all falling to the bottom of the deepest pockets of the crevasse, only to reappear in 1899 on the Rocher des Motets. Malloy soon realizes that he must make a sacrifice. Quoting, "And while I gaze thus at my stones, revolving interminable martingales, all equally defective, it suddenly dawned on the former, his mind, dimly that I might perhaps achieve my purpose without increasing the number of pockets or reducing the number of my stones, but simply sacrificing the principle of trim." The sacrifice, then, is aesthetic. Remember the beauty of Galton's composite. His elegant system is rendered ugly as trim is abandoned and he loads himself asymmetrically. Quoting, "Here it is in all its hideousness." And what he does is he puts 6, there's this kind of incredible description of the process that I'm going to try to abbreviate here, but he sets up a supply stock pocket. He puts 6 stones in the right pocket of his greatcoat, the newly designated supply pocket. The left coat pocket is empty. Both trouser pockets have 5 stones. He sucks all 6 from the right pocket one by one, transferring them to the left empty pocket. When this right pocket is empty, he rotates the contents of all pockets clockwise by one pocket, thus resetting the system, and then continues the subcycle as above, resetting whenever the supply pocket is again empty ad infinitum. Only this way can Malloy be sure all 16 stones, quote, will have been sucked at least once in impeccable succession, not one sucked twice, not one left unsucked. But he says, this solution is not without a price. Abandoning the trim, he says, quote, was painful to me, bodily. I felt the weight of the other stones dragging me now to one side, now to the other. But the need to suck the stones in a way that was, quote, not haphazard, but with method, was also, I think, a bodily need. Here, then, were 2 incompatible bodily needs at loggerhead. So Malloy's loggerheads is the meeting of measure that actually measures with measure that looks like it measures, is this kind of aesthetic crisis within all exactitude, within measure, when the aesthetics, in a sense, compromises its job, its utility, its true precision, one could say. It is the tension between the precision true to its purpose and an aesthetic of precision, exactitude fetishized. The mer de glace did not satisfy Vallot's bodily needs either. The cache of orphan stones, coloured stones, lost in its secret's linings, no doubt with fading numbers on their faces, are testimony to the anxious industry of 19th century measure, getting ready for 20th and now 21st century prediction. Beckett's many industrious attempts to design wholly pointless actions and systems that, to paraphrase his edict on inexpression, do nothing, with nothing, from nothing, to nothing, for nothing, speak acutely to the practice of measure and the exactitude to which it attends. As Beckett understood, the design of a project of pure pointlessness is the most difficult and the most important thing to achieve, a project of burning illogicality, the flame which consumes all our filthy logic. Molloy's attempts to design such a system, his anxious perfecting of its abject pointlessness, is ultimately sabotaged by his nostalgia for the principles of trim, for the filthy logic of symmetry's normal curve. Thus, we're reminded that any project of exactitude is not simply about power and control and the quantification it procures and all of the kind of problematization of that that's already been unpacked, but is also always an aesthetic project, and vice versa. Any practice of measure is doomed to occupy the space of this conflict between genuine engagement with the object and the measuring subject's auto-seduction by the aestheticization of method and its registers. Always an own goal. We're always kicking own goals when we are working with exactitude. An own goal that leaves us, like Molloy, contentedly sucking, yet deluded. Beckett's revolving martingales, however, give us a clue. The martingales that sabotage Molloy's delusion. In the same year that Galton makes his quincokes and Vallot plants numbered stones in the glacier, that is in 1893, this incredible year, C.S. Peirce, American philosopher and surveyor of the US coastline, writes this: "Chance itself pours in at every avenue of sense. It is of all things the most obtrusive. That it is absolute is the most manifest of all intellectual perceptions. That it is a being, living and conscious, is what all the dullness that belongs to ratiocination self can scarce muster the hardihood to deny." The Galton board resurfaces one last time in the Pear Lab, the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory, in 1979, where it's subjected to tests in psychokinesis as experimenters attempt to free caprice and causality from Galton's trim by willing, for example, all the balls to the right. As the operator says, they may not look like they're doing much, but they're trying to influence the output of these machines with their minds. The ones who get the best results don't think too hard about it, end quote.
Right. Yeah, everybody get hit of that. Okay, everybody in your room, all go off to the right. They did an experiment from 1,000 miles away.
There you go, all the balls to the right. Let's hope soon all the balls go to the left. The scientists note that women get larger results than men, but often in the direction they did not intend. I love that. That two people working together do better than a lone operator. That a man and a woman in a relationship produce startling results. However, that when groups of local elementary school children tour the lab, the results are, quote, off the charts. Princeton closed down the lab as a scientific embarrassment in 2007. Many thanks.
Thank you so much. Laure will come on to ask you a first question and then I will ask you another one. But your voice, we could hear it very little at the end. So maybe just at the end, just the last 2 minutes or so.
Yeah, it was just like the last minute. Your voice was a little bit more faint, but hopefully we can.
Okay.
Okay, I think maybe that's better. Just going to relay first a question in the Q&A. a question from an attendee. Francesca, do you understand exacerbated capitalism as a filthy logic?
Of course. Of course. All filthy logics are joined up.
Can you expand a little bit on that?
Well, I think one could say carbon logic is a filthy logic, capitalism is a filthy logic. I mean, in a sense, you know, guess who really loves the Galton board? The market. You know, this thing that, you know, in a sense emerges from social sciences, and in a sense from a kind of genuine desire to understand what the forces at work in society and understand injustice to an extent, ultimately ends up being completely fetishized by the market.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's kind of staging by the Eameses in the Mathematica exhibition and then putting it literally at the front door of the IBM pavilion, where, you know, the way it's used in that film is raining down balls. You know, what is this? Is this the trickle down? Is this the raining down of money? You know, and who's going to be in the middle of the hump of the curve and who's going to be out at the edges? Well, we know that. Yeah. So yes, of course.
I think it's interesting that, you know, the object itself is fetishized, you know, as, you know, having a kind of magic, you know, there's something, you know, it's the embodiment of hyper rationality and calculation and exactitude on the one hand, but it does seem to possess a kind of iconic power, you know, as you underline.
Well, this is why I kind of hinted at, but then, you know, stopped myself from veering off into the guillotine, because it is this extraordinary epistemic machine like the guillotine, and is worshipped and has this iconic power and is able to make visible and comprehensive that which is by definition invisible, incomprehensive. You know, it's incomprehensible that you chop the head off the king, for instance. You know, it's incomprehensible that you separate the state in that way. So it's and the cloud chamber, you know, the cloud chamber also has, but it's, in a sense, it's a harder object to hold in that iconic way, because it's, you know, it's cloudy. But yes, certainly.
Sorry, yes, I was going to bring up the guillotine. So you just, that was my question. You know, so you did bring it up, as, you know, you called it an epistemic machine. You know, I guess also because it goes on and on. It's never. It just, perhaps there's also the idea of a kind of a perpetual movement. You know, of a mechanism that has no end in sight. That just keeps going mechanically, so that it seems to be going off by itself instead of being controlled by humans.
Absolutely. I mean, there, you know, I kind of said that it didn't, I mean, it didn't evolve because it was perfect. And in a sense, it didn't evolve because it was perfect, which is always, you know, always should worry us if things don't evolve. But it did evolve in that it was added to it for the Mathematica exhibition is this conveyor belt that carries the balls back up to the top that you see in that hilarious video when the guy's saying all the balls to the right, and feeds it back into the top. So it does, yes, you're right, absolutely, become this kind of perpetual motion machine.
Thank you so much, Francesca. There's another question in the Q&A. Michael, do you want to take up the second question?
Sure. It's amusing more than a question. It says, I'm thinking about the relationship of your talk to Eric's presentation of the UVA Memorial. In particular, how he uses computation and a certain kind of data to quantify in architectural space that which is so hard to capture: grief, memory, and erasure. Taking measure of these very real but intangible phenomena endows a new visibility and meaning to exactness of the design and manufacturing process and the ineffable. Technology helps to track the boulders in the glacier, perhaps?
Very interesting question. I guess technology helps to track the movement of the glacier, yes. But when the movement of the glacier, when the glacier kind of starts to eat the technology, swallow up the stones, or not deliver the measurements desired, then there is this extraordinary kind of cleaving of technology as employed by systems of measure and the subject to be measured. And, you know, I mean, it would be kind of great in a sense to discuss with Eric how the, you know, that incredible moment of conflict, how the kind of systems of measure, of quantification, in a sense, meet, as, you know, he talked about the meeting of the archaic and the state of the art, you know, how these two things meet and what happens. I mean, in a sense, so much of my work in the past has been looking at that space of negotiation, that space of what happens. And what we often see happening is that the system of measure has so much desire built into it, has so much kind of aesthetic of momentum, that it just cleaves away from the actual business of measuring. So what it produces is kind of incredible redundancy of precision that marked the 20th century. And I've discussed Conrad Bachmann with Mark before, but Bachmann was intent on eliminating all redundancies from architecture, to the point that he was eliminating architecture, as Mark has so beautifully argued. But in a sense, the one redundancy he doesn't eliminate is that of redundant precision. It becomes super augmented within the system. So there is, coming back to your question by your anonymous attendee, there is this measurement of the intangible is obviously what the Galton box is trying to kind of almost, in a sense, silence once and for all. Hence, hacking talks about the taming of chance. Hence, Peirce brings up chance again as this thing that will always be most obtrusive to our senses, always be the thing that we can't measure. And obviously is the thing that remains the kind of central problem for computation.
This is actually was going to be my question, but then we have another question coming up for you. And so in all fairness, let's first read that question and then we'll see if you will have the patience for another one. So your talk makes me think of Conway's law, the idea that in programming a script might work perfectly for those who have created it, but not for others. An example of this is facial recognition software and how it can accurately discern white people, but people of color are a lot less accurate. I wonder if Conway's law can also be applied to architecture, if the measurements that we apply to its success work perfectly for those of us who create it, but not to others. Are we creating a reality of success of architecture by measuring it according to our own desire and therefore eliminating the experience of architecture by others?
Wow, that's a great question. I don't know Conway's law, so I will look it up. And yes, the kind of inbuilt bias in image recognition, in a way, tells us things about measure that have been going on all along, exposes it in kind of quite chilling ways. I kind of touched briefly upon it at the end of the Encyclopédie Diderot. There's this extraordinary passage by Diderot saying, you know, in a sense, there are all of these patterns that appear to be here, and they may be true and real, or they may not, and one should always be careful, and that one should always be careful about overfitting. And there is, it's the overfitting in certain moments of image recognition that set up extraordinary and errors, let's say, errors of judgment. Whether the question's gone from the Q&A now, but how that, and I guess we can, we would be stupid, we would be foolish not to realize that if this goes on with image recognition, it will go on with every other aspect of measure, and it will certainly go on with architecture as well, in terms of this kind of overfitting that's going on in the scanning of all architectural drawings right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, my question was related to the current state of architectural drawings and representation. And I was going to ask you to perhaps talk a little bit about how there is now at least the promise, it might be a false promise, but this sway towards things that can offer change, randomness, chance, things that were not part of the promise of the digital when it was essentially brought to architecture. And so I was hoping that you would be able to speak a little bit about that, but I also understand that it's late, so maybe this is something that we can address further tomorrow, but if you would like to give a brief answer.
Well, it'd be great to come back this tomorrow. It's a beautiful question. I mean, in a sense, just briefly, if like Morozov, this is not a critique of big data or computation, it's a critique of how it's being used and the filthy logics that it is in service to currently. And clearly a way to, in a sense, undermine that is to employ the aleatory and the random. And this is something that Beckett, in his eternal relevance, eternal genius, frequently did. And if how one starts to de-optimize architectural production and perhaps, call in, what is it that the fantastic phrase, I mean, I'm so moved by that phrase from Peirce. Talking about chance as living and conscious is what all the dullness that belongs to ratiocination self. I mean, all the dullness, for me, optimization is all the dullness. Why would one ever want that? And what actually, and optimized for who, and all these things, we can kind of come to. So how one can kind of de-optimize and invoke the living and conscious, which the psychokinesis, hilarious people in the Princeton lab were doing with incredible exactitude. I mean, there's a whole other thing there. I think is a way out of this corridor that apparently has no exit. We have to find the exits.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Francesca. And I just want to thank everyone who has stayed with us and our wonderful panelists. And so we have the other half tomorrow, and we will continue discussing, and hopefully we can maybe extend and continue an open discussion during or after the round table for anybody who likes to stay around.